Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift back to a time when human beings believed they could build almost anything, an age of iron and steam, of tall chimneys and patient labor, when the world seemed to grow larger and more capable with every passing year. It was a confident century, and one of its proudest dreams took the shape of a ship. We will not begin tonight with disaster, nor with the famous cold night that the world remembers. We will begin instead with something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. We will begin with the building of the thing itself. For before any ship can cross an ocean, it must first be imagined, then drawn, then slowly raised from raw metal by thousands of hands. The vessel we know as the Titanic did not appear all at once. She was assembled over years, plate by plate and rivet by rivet, in a shipyard in the north of Ireland, in the city of Belfast. To understand how such a thing came to exist, we have to set aside the ending we already know. We have to return to the beginning, when she was not a legend or a warning, but simply an enormous problem to be solved, a challenge of steel, arithmetic, and human will. Think of the scale of it. A moving structure longer than the tallest buildings of the age, laid on their sides, weighing tens of thousands of tons, meant to carry thousands of people across the deepest waters on earth. It would need to float, to move under its own power, to house and feed and light a small traveling town. Nothing quite like it had been attempted at this size before. The ship would stretch more than 880 feet from bow to stern, rise as high as a building of 11 stories, and displace a weight of water difficult for the mind to hold. Every part of her had to be invented, ordered, forged, and fitted into place. This was the era that gave us great bridges, vast railways, and engines that never seemed to tire. People had begun to trust machinery the way earlier generations had trusted the seasons. If a thing could be measured and drawn, it was widely believed, then surely it could also be built and sent out into the world. And so the people who set out to build her faced a question that sounds almost impossible when spoken aloud. How do you begin to construct the largest moving object that human beings have ever made? Where does a thing like that even start? If these quiet journeys help you rest, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep while learning something new. Tonight, let your thoughts settle, and let us return to the years before the voyage, to a shipyard slowly filling with the shape of something vast. The answer, as we will see, did not begin with the ship at all. It began with the world that wanted her. To understand why anyone would build such a ship, we must first picture the ocean that lay between two worlds. In those years, the North Atlantic was the great highway of the age, a wide and restless stretch of water separating Europe from America. Across it moved letters, goods, fortunes, and above all, people. Millions were crossing in that era, many of them leaving the old countries behind in search of new lives. Families carried everything they owned in a single trunk, bound for harbors they had only heard of in stories. The ships that carried them were not luxuries but lifelines, the only practical way to cross an ocean that no bridge could span. There was money in this crossing, and there was pride. Great shipping companies competed for the trade, each trying to offer something the others could not. To win passengers was to win prestige, and prestige in that confident century could be measured in steel and steam. For a long while, the fiercest competition was about speed. Lines raced to claim the fastest crossing, an honor informally known as the Blue Riband, awarded to whichever ship made the quickest passage. Cunard, a leading British company, had built two famously swift vessels, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which held that honor and the public imagination alike. Speed, though, came at a cost. Fast ships often shook and trembled with the force of their own engines, and the crossing could be a rough, noisy affair. There was a different question quietly waiting to be asked. What if a ship did not need to be the fastest, but instead the largest, the steadiest, and the most comfortable? This was the path chosen by a rival company, the White Star Line. Rather than chase the Blue Riband, its leaders decided to compete on a different ground entirely. They would offer size and serenity, grand interiors and a smooth passage, the feeling of crossing the ocean within a floating hotel rather than a racing machine. It was a shrewd idea and a revealing one. It suggested that the journey itself could become the attraction, that people might choose a ship not for how quickly it arrived, but for how it felt aboard her. Comfort, in this vision, was an engineering challenge of its own. At the head of the White Star Line stood a managing director named Joseph Bruce Ismay, a man of ambition and exacting taste. Together with the financial backing of powerful interests across the Atlantic, he helped set in motion a plan unlike anything the company had attempted before. The plan was not for one ship, but for a family of them, enormous vessels larger than any afloat, designed to dominate the crossing for a generation. And to build them, the company would turn to a shipyard it had trusted for many years, in a city whose very name had become bound up with the building of ships. That city was Belfast, and its great yard was about to take on the largest task of its history. The idea took firmer shape in the closing years of the first decade of the 20th century. Around the year 1908, the White Star Line committed itself to a bold and expensive vision. It would build not a single great liner, but a trio of them, sister ships of unprecedented size. They would belong to what came to be called the Olympic class, named for the first of the three. The plan was for vessels so large that they would set a new standard for the crossing, ships against which all others would be measured. The names chosen carried a certain grandeur of their own. The first would be the Olympic, the second the Titanic, and the third, later, the Britannic. The names reached toward the mythic and the immense, toward Titans and Olympians, toward something larger than ordinary life. In an age fond of grand gestures, the ambition was written plainly, even in what the ships were called. Behind the company stood deep pockets. The White Star Line had come under the control of a vast American financial combination, an enterprise assembled by the powerful financier John Pierpont Morgan. His interests gathered many shipping lines under one umbrella, and the resources behind the new ships were correspondingly large. The guiding principle remained what it had been. These ships would not try to win the race for speed. They would instead be the grandest and steadiest vessels afloat, built for a smooth and dignified passage rather than a swift and shuddering one. To achieve this, the designers leaned toward sheer size. A larger ship rides more calmly through rough seas, its great length spanning the waves rather than pitching upon them. Size, in other words, was not only about luxury or boasting. It served the comfort that the whole strategy depended upon. Each of the sisters would carry the marks of careful thought. There would be space for elaborate public rooms, for wide promenades, for dining saloons that felt more like halls in a fine hotel than chambers aboard a ship. Yet beneath all of that grace lay an immense framework of metal that had to be designed first. For grandeur of this kind does not float on wishes. It rests upon a hull, a skeleton, an engine, and 1,000 calculations about weight, balance, and strength. Before any chandelier could be hung or any staircase carved, the underlying vessel had to be conceived in exact and demanding detail. That work fell to a shipyard with a long and proud history and to a small group of designers who would spend countless hours bent over drawing tables. They had agreed, in effect, to invent something near the limits of what their age could make. The dream had been declared, and now it had to be drawn. And so our story moves from the boardrooms and ambitions of the shipping world to the place where steel would actually be cut and shaped. It moves to Belfast. Belfast, in those years, was a city that lived and breathed by the sea. Set on the northeastern edge of Ireland, where a river widened into a broad lough that opened toward the ocean, it had grown into one of the great industrial centers of its time, and at the heart of its industry stood the shipyard. The yard belonged to a firm called Harland and Wolff, founded decades earlier by two men whose names it still carried. Edward Harland, an engineer of restless energy, and Gustav Wolff, his partner, had built the business into one of the finest shipbuilders in the world. By the early 20th century, its reputation reached far beyond Ireland. The yard occupied reclaimed land near the mouth of the river, a flat expanse known as Queen's Island. There, the ground itself had been shaped for the purpose, dredged and filled and leveled to bear the weight of enormous ships under construction. The whole landscape had been bent toward a single task, for Harland and Wolff held a long and trusting relationship with the White Star Line. The two companies had worked together for many years, the shipyard building vessel after vessel for the line. There was an understanding between them, almost like a partnership, in which White Star brought its ambitions and the yard supplied the skill to realize them. The scale of the workforce was staggering. In its busiest years, the yard employed something close to 15,000 workers, an army of men who poured through its gates each morning. They came on foot through the streets of Belfast, their numbers so great that a single shift could fill the roads. These were the people who would actually build the ship. Among them were draftsmen and engineers, but also riveters, platers, joiners, painters, and laborers of every kind. Shipbuilding gathered 100 trades into one effort, each depending on the others. The work was hard and often dangerous, carried out in all weather, high above the ground or deep within steel chambers. Wages were modest, hours were long, and injury was a constant companion. Yet there was pride in it, too, the pride of men who could point to a great hull on the horizon and say quietly that they had helped to raise it. The city and the yard were woven together. Families sent fathers and sons to the same trades across generations. The rhythm of the shipyard horn marked the hours of Belfast as surely as any church bell, calling thousands to work and releasing them again at day's end. It was into this world, busy and skilled and proud, that the order for the new ships arrived. The yard would need to prepare not only its workers, but its very ground and structures for a task larger than any it had faced. The sisters of the Olympic class would test the limits of the place. Before a single plate could be laid, the builders would have to build something else first. They would have to build the means of building. Long before any metal was cut, the ship existed only on paper. She was born in the drawing offices of the shipyard, in great bright rooms where designers bent over wide tables, drawing lines that would one day become walls of steel. It was patient, exacting work, carried out with pencils, rulers, and an enormous store of knowledge. The broad vision had been shaped at the highest levels. The chairman of the shipyard, a formidable figure named William Peary, had helped conceive the new ships in conversation with the leaders of the White Star Line. Peary understood both the business and the craft, and his influence ran through every stage of the project. Yet, much of the detailed design fell to a younger man, his nephew, Thomas Andrews. Andrews was a gifted naval architect who came to oversee the design department, and he poured himself into the work with rare devotion. He knew the ships intimately, down to small details that others might have overlooked. Designing a vessel of this size was a problem of astonishing complexity. Every choice rippled outward into others. The length of the hull affected its strength, which affected its weight, which affected how deep it would sit in the water and how much it could safely carry. At the heart of it all lay an ancient and simple truth about why ships float. A vessel rests upon the water because it pushes aside a volume of water whose weight equals its own. This is the principle of displacement, known since antiquity, and every line on the drawing table had to honor it. So the designers thought constantly in terms of balance. The weight of the steel, the engines, the coal, the cargo, the passengers, all of it had to be accounted for and distributed. A ship too heavy in one place or too narrow for its length could ride badly or strain against itself in heavy seas. There were tools to help them. Builders of the age relied on careful calculation, on models tested in tanks of water, and on the accumulated wisdom of decades of shipbuilding. Much was known, refined through generations of trial and gradual improvement, and the designers worked within that long tradition. Yet the sheer size of these ships pushed gently beyond familiar ground. Some of what was required had rarely or never been attempted at such a scale. The designers had to extend known methods outward, trusting that what held true for smaller vessels would hold in proportion for these giants. In this way, the ship slowly took form in ink and graphite, in thousands of drawings that specified every frame and plate and fitting. It was an act of imagination, disciplined by mathematics, a dream rendered in precise and sober lines. Only when the plans were ready could the real labor begin. And when it did, the first thing the builders raised would not be the ship at all, but the towering structure within which she would be born. A ship the size of the Olympic and the Titanic could not simply be assembled on open ground. The builders needed a structure to work within, a framework of steel tall enough to surround a rising hull and strong enough to carry the cranes that would lift its heavy parts into place. So before the ships came the scaffold. That scaffold was the great gantry, an enormous lattice of steel beams that towered over the slipways where the sisters would be built. It was constructed by a renowned Scottish engineering firm led by William Arrol, a company already famous for raising some of the largest bridges of the age. Building the means of construction was itself a major feat of engineering. The gantry stood over a pair of slipways, the inclined berths from which the ships would later slide into the water. From a distance it resembled a vast metal cathedral open to the sky, its girders climbing high above the yard. Within its frame, two of the largest ships in the world could be built side by side. Running along and across this structure were cranes and lifts, machines that could hoist steel beams and plates to whatever height the work required. A worker, high on the gantry, could look down upon the slowly growing hull and out across the rooftops of Belfast toward the loft beyond. It was a workplace unlike almost any other. There was a quiet logic in all of this. To build something unprecedented, one often has to build the tools to build it first. The gantry was not the ship and would never sail anywhere, yet without it the ship could not exist. It was an investment in possibility, a promise made in steel. The slipways beneath the gantry were themselves carefully prepared. They sloped gently toward the water, their surfaces built to bear immense weight and, in time, to let that weight slide free. Everything was arranged so that the finished hull could one day be released into the river in a single dramatic moment. For now, though, the slipways lay mostly empty, waiting. The gantry rose above them like the frame of an unfinished idea ready to be filled. Around it, the ordinary business of the yard continued, but here a special kind of anticipation gathered. It is worth pausing on how strange and bold this was. The builders had committed enormous resources of money, metal, and labor to a structure whose only purpose was to help create something else. They were, in a sense, building backward, raising the cradle before the child. And the analogy is not idle, for what would soon take shape beneath the gantry began, like all great vessels, with a single foundational line. The first piece of the ship to be laid down would be the long spine running the length of her bottom. That spine was the keel, and with its laying, the Titanic would truly begin to exist. The keel is the backbone of a ship, the long structural line that runs from bow to stern along the very bottom of the hull. Everything else is built upon it and around it. To lay the keel is to commit the first real metal of a vessel to the world, and it has long been treated almost as a birth. The keel of the Titanic was laid in the spring of 1909 on one of the slipways beneath the great gantry. Her elder sister, the Olympic, had been begun only a few months earlier on the berth beside her. For a time, the two would rise together, side by side, like twins growing in parallel, an extraordinary sight in a yard already accustomed to large ships. From the keel, the builders began to raise the frames. These were the curved ribs of the ship, great vertical members of steel rising from the spine at regular intervals along its length. Seen from the ground, they formed a slowly lengthening cage, the unmistakable shape of a hull, beginning to emerge. Each frame had to be shaped according to the plans drawn months before. The steel was heated until it could be worked, then bent and set to match the precise curve required at its place in the hull. A ship is not a simple box, and its sides swell and taper in subtle ways. So each rib differed slightly from its neighbors along the length of the vessel. Watching this skeleton grow must have been a stirring sight. Where once there had been only an empty slipway, now a vast ribbed form climbed toward the gantry above. The shape was still open to the sky and sea air, more outline than vessel, yet already its enormous scale was plain to anyone who looked. Workers moved among the frames on temporary platforms and ladders, fastening and bracing as the structure rose. The hull took form from the bottom upward and from the center outward, a careful, deliberate process that could not be rushed. Strength had to be built in at every stage. There was something almost skeletal and beautiful about this phase. The ship resembled the fossil of some great creature, its ribs arching against the light, hinting at the body that would one day clothe them. It was the most honest moment in the ship's making, when its underlying structure stood plainly visible. All of this framing served a single purpose: to give the ship the strength to endure the sea. The ocean is not gentle, and a hull must resist the constant push and twist of waves without cracking or sagging. The skeleton was where that strength was first established. Yet a skeleton alone cannot float or sail. The open frames had to be covered, sealed against the water, turned from a cage into a continuous and watertight body. For that, the builders would clothe the ribs in a skin of steel, and the making of that skin would call upon the metalworking knowledge of an entire age. To turn the open skeleton into a sealed hull, the builders covered the frames with steel plates. These were large, heavy sheets of metal, laid over the ribs and joined edge to edge until they formed a continuous outer skin. Layer by layer, the cage of frames disappeared beneath this growing surface. The plates were not small. Many measured several feet wide and a good deal more in length, and each weighed enough that lifting it into place required cranes and the coordinated effort of several workers at once. Thousands of such plates were needed to cover a hull more than 800 feet in length. Each plate had to be cut, shaped, and drilled before it could be hung in position. Holes were punched or drilled along the edges so that the plates could later be fastened to the frames and to one another. The fit had to be close, for any gap in the skin was a place where the sea might one day find its way in. The steel itself was a product of the age, made in great mills and rolled into sheets of the required thickness. By the standards of the time, it was strong and dependable, the same kind of material being used in bridges, buildings, and machines across the industrial world. The builders worked with the best metal their era could readily supply. Yet metallurgy in those years was still a developing science. Engineers understood a great deal about how steel behaved under ordinary conditions, how it bore weight and resisted strain. What was less well understood was how certain steels could behave in extreme cold, where some grow more brittle and less forgiving than they are in milder conditions. This was not a failing unique to one shipyard. It reflected the limits of what the whole world then knew about materials. The deeper study of how metals fracture in freezing water would come only in later generations, refined long after these ships were built. It is one of the quiet truths of engineering that every structure is built upon the knowledge available at the time. The designers and metalworkers used sound materials and proven methods, and by the measures they had, the hull was strong. Some lessons can only be learned afterward, written into the understanding of those who come next. For the builders in Belfast, the immediate task was clear and demanding enough. They had to clothe an enormous frame in steel, plate by plate, until the great ribbed cage became a smooth and solid body. Slowly, the hull began to look less like a skeleton and more like a ship. But laying a plate against a frame is not the same as fastening it there. The plates and the frames had to be bound together into a single, unyielding whole, strong enough to hold against the ocean for years. That binding was the work of the rivet and of the men who drove them by the million. A rivet is a simple thing, a short rod of metal with a head on one end. Yet it was the humble rivet, repeated in vast numbers, that held the Titanic together. Some accounts place the number of rivets in her hull at around 3,000,000, each one set in place by human hands. The principle was straightforward, but demanding. A rivet was heated until it glowed, then pushed through holes aligned in the overlapping plates and frames. While still hot and soft, its plain end was hammered flat, forming a second head. As the metal cooled, it contracted and drew the plates together into a tight, lasting grip. This work was done by teams known as rivet squads, often groups of 4 or 5 men working in close coordination. One heated the rivets in a small portable furnace until they reached the right, glowing temperature. A younger member, sometimes little more than a boy, would catch or carry each fiery rivet swiftly to the waiting hole, where others drove and shaped it before it could cool. The labor was loud, hot, and relentless. The clamor of hammers rang across the yard from dawn until dusk, a metallic chorus that became the very sound of shipbuilding. Workers grew skilled at their roles through endless repetition, their movements falling into a practiced rhythm. In some parts of the ship, powerful machines did the riveting, pressing the metal into shape with hydraulic force. These machines could set rivets more uniformly and with greater strength than human arms alone. But in many areas, especially the curved ends of the hull where the great machines could not easily reach, the work still had to be done by hand, swung hammer by swung hammer. It was dangerous work. Men labored at great heights along the curving hull, handled metal hot enough to burn, and endured noise that could damage hearing over the years. Accidents were not rare in a yard of this size, and the building of a great ship was paid for in part in human injury and sometimes in life. There is something humbling in this. We remember the Titanic as a single magnificent object, but she was in truth the sum of countless small acts of labor. Every joint in her hull was a place where some unnamed worker had heated, carried, and hammered a piece of metal into place. The rivets, multiplied beyond easy imagining, slowly bound the whole vessel into one. Plate joined to plate and frame to frame until the hull became a single continuous structure, strong and sealed against the water. The skeleton had been clothed, and the clothing made fast. Yet the builders did not rely on the outer hull alone to keep the sea at bay. Deep within the ship, they had designed a second line of defense, hidden beneath the decks and the cargo. It was an arrangement meant to make the vessel safe, even if her outer skin were one day breached. Beneath the lowest deck of the ship lay a feature that few passengers would ever see, yet that spoke clearly of the builder's care. The Titanic was given a double bottom, 2 layers of steel along the base of the hull with a space between them. Should the outer layer be torn, the inner one might still hold back the sea. Above this foundation rose another element of the ship's defense, a series of great walls running across the hull from side to side. These were the bulkheads, transverse partitions that divided the lower body of the ship into separate sections. The vessel was split, in effect, into a row of large compartments. There were 16 such compartments along her length, sealed off from one another by these heavy walls. The idea was that if the hull were pierced and water rushed in, it would be confined to one compartment, or perhaps a few, rather than spreading freely through the whole ship. The flooding could be contained. To make this work, the bulkheads were fitted with watertight doors. In ordinary use, these doors could stand open, allowing movement between compartments. But they could be closed, sealing each section so that water entering one space would be trapped there and kept from the others. This was a thoughtful and respected design, common in the best ships of the age. By the reasoning of the time, the vessel could stay afloat even if several of her forward compartments were flooded. To many, this made her seem extraordinarily safe, and some spoke of her as practically unsinkable. It is worth being precise about that famous phrase. The builders did not promise the impossible. The claim was that under the conditions then imagined, with a likely collision flooding only a limited number of compartments, the ship was designed to survive. Within those assumptions, the reasoning was sound. Yet every design rests upon what its makers can foresee. The bulkheads did not rise the full height of the ship, but only to a certain deck, since walls reaching higher would have interfered with the use of the spaces above. Under the expected sorts of damage, this was thought entirely sufficient. Here we touch gently the edge of the story we are setting aside tonight. The safety of any ship is bounded by the situations its designers had in mind. A different kind of damage, of a sort few had seriously imagined, could one day exceed those careful provisions. For now, though, the compartments and their doors stood as a genuine achievement, the considered work of people trying earnestly to make the sea less dangerous. The hull was strong, divided, and double-bottomed, built with real attention to safety. With her body complete and her defenses in place, the great hull was nearly ready for a single spectacular moment, the day she would first meet the water. A launch is one of the great moments in the life of a ship. It is the day the hull leaves the land for the first time and enters the water that will carry it for the rest of its existence. For a vessel as large as the Titanic, such a day drew crowds and quiet awe alike. When the Titanic was launched in the late spring of 1911, she was still far from finished. What slid into the water that day was only the bare hull, an empty shell of steel without engines, funnels, or interiors. The launch released the structure so that the slipway could be cleared and the long work of completion could begin elsewhere. In keeping with the custom of the White Star Line, there was no breaking of a bottle, no formal christening, only the plain and powerful act of letting the hull take to the water, moving so vast a weight from land to water, was itself a delicate operation. The hull rested on the inclined slipway, held in place until the moment of release. Beneath it, the ways were coated with tons of soap, tallow, and grease, a slick surface to let the enormous mass slide smoothly down toward the river. At the chosen moment, the final restraints were freed, and gravity took hold. The great hull began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed as it slid down the greased ways. In less than a minute, thousands of tons of steel passed from the land into the water of the river below. The forces involved were immense, and the builders had to manage them with care. Heavy chains and weights were arranged to drag against the moving hull, slowing it so that it would not rush too far or too fast once afloat. The aim was a controlled descent, not a wild plunge. For those watching, it was an unforgettable sight. A structure the size of a great building, seemingly far too large to move, glided down into the river and settled upon the water, floating at last. The whole descent took only about a minute, the work of months sliding free in moments, and the cheering must have echoed across the yard and the loft beyond. Yet, even afloat, the hull was not yet a ship in any working sense. It could not move under its own power, for it had no engines installed. It had no upper decks finished, no funnels, no fittings, none of the machinery and comfort that would one day fill it. It was a beginning made buoyant, The launch, then, marked a transition rather than a completion. The structural phase, the raising of the hull on the slipway, was over. Now the vessel would be towed to a different part of the yard for the next great stage of her making. That stage was called fitting out, and it would transform the empty hull into a living, working ship. Engines would be lowered in, decks built up, cabins and saloons constructed within. The bare shell that floated upon the river still had a long road to travel before it could cross an ocean. After the launch, the bare hull was towed to a quieter corner of the yard, to a deep water wharf, where the long work of fitting out would take place. Here, the empty shell would be filled, layered, and finished until it became a complete ship. This phase would take roughly a year, longer than the launch day's spectacle might suggest. Fitting out was, in many ways, the most intricate stage of all. The structural work had been about strength and shape. Now the task was to install everything that made the ship function and live, from its massive machinery to the smallest fitting in a cabin. To handle the heaviest parts, the yard relied on powerful cranes, including a great floating crane capable of lifting enormous loads. Engines, boilers, and other huge components had to be lowered carefully into the hull through openings in the decks. It was like assembling the organs of a vast body, each set precisely in its place. The upper decks and superstructure were built up during this time as well. What had floated away as an open-topped hull gradually gained its full height, deck upon deck, until the familiar profile of a great liner began to appear. The funnels would be raised, the bridge constructed, the lifeboats and davits added. Within the hull, an entire interior world took shape. Carpenters, joiners, and craftsmen built the cabins, corridors, dining saloons, and public rooms. Some spaces were made plain and practical, others richly decorated, for the ship was meant to carry travelers of very different means across the same ocean. The famous luxury of the vessel belonged to this stage. Grand staircases, paneled lounges, and elegant rooms were constructed and finished by skilled hands. Yet, behind every beautiful surface lay pipes, wires, and structures, the hidden systems that allowed the ship to be warmed, lit, and supplied. The complexity was staggering. A great liner needed plumbing for fresh water, systems to manage waste, kitchens able to feed thousands at a sitting, refrigeration to keep food fresh through a long voyage, and a network of electrical wiring threading through the whole vessel. Each system had to be designed, installed, and tested, and each had to work in concert with the others once the ship was at sea. In this way, the ship slowly came alive. Where the launched hull had been a hollow space echoing with the sea, the fitted-out vessel hummed with the promise of machinery and habitation. The transformation from structure to ship was nearly complete. At the very heart of all this lay the machinery that would actually drive the vessel forward. For all her grandeur, the Titanic was, in the end, a thing meant to move across water under her own power. To understand how she did so, we must descend into her depths, to the great engines waiting in her belly. Deep within the Titanic, Occupying a great portion of her lower body lay the machinery that turned coal and steam into motion. The heart of this system was a clever combination of two different kinds of engine working together to drive the ship forward. It was an elegant marriage of an older technology and a newer one. The first kind was the reciprocating engine, a powerful and well-proven design. In such an engine, steam pushes pistons back and forth within great cylinders, and that back and forth motion is turned into the spinning of a shaft. The Titanic carried two of these enormous engines, each rising several stories from base to top, among the largest of their type ever built. Their pistons and rods were so vast that a person could stand beside them and feel very small indeed. These two reciprocating engines drove the ship's two outer propellers, one on each side. They were dependable and strong, the kind of machinery that had powered ships for many years. But the designers added something more, a way to wring further use from the steam before it was discarded. After steam had done its work in the reciprocating engines, it still held energy, though at a lower pressure. Rather than waste it, the designers routed this exhaust steam into a third engine of a different kind, a turbine. In a turbine, steam rushes past many curved blades, spinning a shaft smoothly and continuously. This low-pressure turbine drove a third propeller set in the center at the stern. So the ship had three propellers in all, two turned by the reciprocating engines and one by the turbine. The arrangement captured energy that would otherwise have been lost, an early example of using a resource twice. There was a graceful logic in this hybrid system. The reciprocating engines offered reliability and the ability to reverse the propellers, important for slowing and maneuvering. The turbine, which could only spin one way, offered smooth and efficient power at steady cruising speed. Together, they gave the ship both flexibility and economy. To stand in the engine rooms must have been an overwhelming experience. The great machines towered overhead, their moving parts vast and powerful, the air thick with heat, oil, and noise. Engineers and oilers tended them constantly, watching gauges and adjusting valves to keep the whole system running in balance. All of this machinery, however, depended upon a single thing: steam. The engines could do nothing without a continuous supply of it, produced in great quantity and at high pressure. Something had to boil enormous volumes of water hour after hour, day after day. That task fell to the boilers and to the men who fed them. Below and forward of the engines lay another world entirely hotter and darker still. It was there, among the furnaces, that the ship's true hunger was satisfied. The boilers were the furnaces that gave the ship its life. The Titanic carried 29 of them, great cylindrical vessels arranged in rows in the lower part of the hull. Within each, coal fires heated water until it became steam, and that steam rose to feed the hungry engines beyond. These were no small stoves. Each boiler stood taller than a person and held several furnace openings along its face, and together they consumed coal in astonishing quantities. A ship like this could burn hundreds of tons of coal in a single day at sea, a relentless appetite that never paused while she sailed. The fires had to be tended without rest, day and night, for as long as the voyage lasted. Feeding the boilers was the work of men known as firemen or stokers, who shoveled coal into the roaring furnaces by hand. Alongside them labored the trimmers, whose task was to move coal from the storage bunkers to the furnaces, keeping the fuel flowing as it was consumed. Together, they were sometimes called the Black Gang, for the coal dust that covered them. Their world was among the harshest aboard the ship. They worked deep below the waterline, in heat so intense that the air shimmered amid the glare of open fires and the constant rhythm of the shovel. Shifts were grueling, the labor punishing, and the noise and heat unrelenting. Yet without them, the ship was nothing. All the elegance above, the staircases and saloons, the smooth power of the great engines, depended entirely on these unseen workers feeding fire into the dark. The serene passage enjoyed by passengers rested upon their ceaseless effort below. The coal itself was stored in large bunkers built into the hull, vast reserves that had to be filled before each voyage by an army of laborers at the dockside. Managing this fuel was a science of its own, for the weight and placement of so much coal affected the balance of the ship. As coal was burned away during the crossing, the trimmers also helped keep that balance steady. There is a striking contrast in all of this. A great ocean liner was admired as a symbol of luxury and progress, gleaming and graceful above the waves. But its motion was born in heat, soot, and exhausting human labor, in spaces few passengers ever glimpsed or imagined. This was the hidden engine of the age, not only of one ship, but of an entire industrial world. Beneath the polished surfaces, fires burned and workers toiled, turning the raw energy of coal into movement and light. The Titanic was, in this sense, a creature of fire as much as of steel. High above these furnaces, the smoke and gases of all this burning had to find their way out into the open air. They rose through great passages toward the sky, and those passages ended in the most recognizable feature of the ship's profile, her tall funnels. Few features of the Titanic are as instantly recognizable as her four great funnels, rising tall above the upper decks. Painted in the buff and black of the White Star Line, they gave the ship a profile of strength and balance, a silhouette that has become famous the world over. Yet there is a quiet secret hidden in those four funnels. A funnel, in essence, is a chimney. Its purpose is to carry away the smoke and hot gases produced by the burning of coal in the boilers below. The rising heat draws the fumes upward and releases them high above the decks, keeping the working spaces and passenger areas clearer of smoke. Each of these funnels was so large that, it was often said, a carriage drawn by horses could have passed through its opening. 3 of the Titanic's funnels did exactly this, each connected to boiler rooms beneath. They served the real and necessary task of venting the fires that drove the ship. In this, they were entirely practical, parts of the great machinery of combustion and motion. The fourth funnel, however, was different. It was not connected to the boilers in the same way, and served little purpose in carrying away their smoke. In large part, it was there for appearance and for ventilation of other spaces, such as the kitchens and engine areas. Why include a funnel that was not strictly needed? The answer lies in perception. To the travelers of the age, the number of funnels suggested power, size, and safety, for the great ships of the day often carried several. A vessel with 4 funnels looked mightier and more reassuring than one with 3, even if the fourth did little real work below. So the designers added the fourth funnel, partly to satisfy the eye and the imagination. It balanced the ship's profile, giving her a stately and symmetrical look. It also reassured passengers, who took the bold array of funnels as a sign of a powerful and trustworthy vessel. There is something revealing in this small choice. The building of a great liner was never only about engineering in the narrow sense. It was also about feeling, about how the ship appeared to those who would sail in her and those who would watch her pass. Form and function walk together. This blending of the practical and the symbolic ran through the whole vessel. She was a machine of steel and fire, but also a stage for human hopes, a floating expression of confidence in the age that built her. The fourth funnel stood as a quiet emblem of that double nature. With her funnels in place, her engines installed, and her interiors taking shape, the Titanic was at last approaching completion. The empty hull that had slid into the river had become a true ship, fitted and furnished, and nearly ready to sail. All that remained was to see whether she would behave at sea as her makers intended. Before she could carry anyone across the ocean, she would have to prove herself at sea. For all her engines and furnaces, the Titanic was meant to be more than a means of travel. She was designed as a kind of floating city, carrying within her the comforts and conveniences of life ashore. To achieve this, she relied on one of the great wonders of the age, electricity. Generating that electricity required machinery of its own. The ship carried steam-driven dynamos, generators that turned some of her steam power into electric current. From these flowed the energy that lit the vessel, warmed parts of it, and powered countless devices throughout her decks. Electric light shone in cabins, corridors, dining rooms, and public spaces, banishing much of the darkness that had haunted ships of earlier eras. Thousands of lamps glowed across the vessel, turning her at night into a constellation of warm windows upon the dark sea. To passengers accustomed to candles and oil lamps at home, this steady brightness felt strikingly modern and reassuring. The electricity did far more than illuminate. It powered lifts that carried passengers between decks, sparing them long climbs of stairs. It drove fans for ventilation, ran the equipment of the kitchens, and operated machinery throughout the ship. A great liner was, in this sense, an early showcase of electrical living. Among the most important systems was refrigeration. To feed thousands of people on a voyage of several days, the ship had to carry vast quantities of food and keep it fresh. Refrigerated rooms and cold stores preserved meat, fish, fruit, and other provisions, a quiet marvel of preservation hidden below. The ship also carried a wireless apparatus, a means of sending and receiving messages through the air across great distances. This technology, still young in those years, allowed a vessel far out at sea to remain in contact with the shore and with other ships. Operators tapped out and received signals in the pulsing code of the day. For passengers, the wireless was often a novelty, a way to send greetings or arrange affairs from the middle of the ocean. But it was also a serious instrument, capable of carrying news and, in time of trouble, calls for help. It tied the lonely ship to a wider web of communication. All of these systems together made the vessel feel less like a fragile craft upon the water and more like a self-contained world. Light, warmth, food, movement, and communication were all provided within her steel walls. She carried her own small civilization across the deep. It was a remarkable achievement, the gathering of so many modern comforts into one moving structure, yet none of it would mean anything until the ship had shown she could actually sail, steer, and stop with reliability. Before her makers could hand her over, she had to be put to the test on open water. In the spring of 1912, the finished ship was at last ready to leave the wharf and move under her own power. The day of her sea trials had come, the first true test of everything that had been built into her. For the engineers who had labored over her, it was a moment of quiet tension. A sea trial is a careful examination of a ship's behavior on the water. Could she reach her intended speed? Could she turn, slow, and stop as her handlers required? Did her engines, steering, and systems all work together as the designers had planned? These questions could only be answered at sea. The Titanic steamed out into the broad waters of Belfast Lough, the sheltered stretch leading from the city toward the open sea. There, away from the crowded yard, her crew put her through a series of maneuvers. She ran at various speeds, testing how swiftly and smoothly she could move. The trials included turning the ship in great curving arcs to learn how she answered her helm. A vessel of such size does not turn quickly, and her handlers needed to understand exactly how she responded and how long her movements took to take effect. They measured how wide a circle she traced and how she behaved as she came about in the water. They also tested how the ship could stop. Bringing so vast a mass to rest was no small matter, for a great deal of momentum had to be overcome. The engines could be reversed, and the trials measured how much distance the ship required to slow and halt from a given speed. There were instruments to adjust as well, including the compasses that would guide her across the ocean. The great mass of steel in the hull could affect a compass, and so it had to be carefully corrected and calibrated. Navigators depended on these readings to find their way over open water. Through the day, the ship performed as her makers had hoped. She moved, turned, and stopped within expected bounds, her machinery running steadily. The years of design and labor had produced a vessel that behaved on the water as a sound and capable ship. The trials lasted only about a day, a brief examination for so large and complex a vessel. With them complete, the Titanic was formally accepted from her builders by the shipping line that had commissioned her. The shipyard had done its work, and the vessel passed into the hands of those who would operate her. It was, in its way, a kind of graduation, the moment a creation leaves its makers and begins its own life. From Belfast, the new ship would sail to take on her crew, her supplies, and her passengers, preparing for the voyage for which she had been built. The achievement of her making was, by every ordinary measure, complete. And here our story reaches the threshold of the night the world remembers. We will not cross far into it, but we cannot ignore it entirely. Before we approach that famous night, it is worth pausing on the spirit of the age that had built this ship. It was a time of deep confidence in progress, in machinery, and in the power of human skill to master nature. The Titanic was, in many ways, a symbol of that confidence. The belief in her safety was real and widely shared. Her watertight compartments, her double bottom, her sheer size, all suggested a vessel of unusual strength. In the popular imagination, and in some of the writing of the time, she came to be spoken of as nearly impossible to sink. It is important to understand that this belief was not pure foolishness. It rested on genuine engineering and on the assumption that any accident would resemble those known before. A collision flooding a few compartments was survivable by design, and such accidents were what experience had taught people to expect. Yet confidence can quietly outrun its foundations. The claim of near unsinkability described the ship under certain imagined conditions, but in the public mind it hardened into something simpler and more absolute. A careful engineering judgment became a popular certainty, broader and bolder than the engineers had meant. One area where the assumptions of the age showed plainly was in the matter of lifeboats. The Titanic carried lifeboats in keeping with the rules of the time, rules that based their requirements largely on the size of the ship rather than the number of people aboard. By those regulations, she was properly equipped. But those rules had been written for an earlier era of smaller ships and had not kept pace with the growing size of vessels. The number of lifeboats, lawful as it was, fell well short of what would be needed to carry everyone aboard. The lifeboats were viewed in part as a means to ferry passengers to rescuing ships, not to hold all souls at once. In this we see not a single villain, but a whole web of assumptions shared across an industry. Designers, regulators, and operators alike worked within a common understanding of what was likely and what was enough. That understanding had simply not caught up with the scale of the new giants. There is a sobering lesson here, gentle but real. The greatest dangers often hide not in obvious flaws, but in shared assumptions so familiar that no one thinks to question them. Confidence becomes a kind of blindness, not through malice, but through the ordinary trust of capable people in their own age. The ship that sailed was a triumph of building, sound in her construction, and admired by nearly all who saw her. The vulnerabilities that mattered most lay less in her steel than in the expectations surrounding her, in the quiet certainties of the people who had made and praised her. And so, with all this in mind, we come softly to the edge of the night itself. On her first crossing, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the Titanic met the limit of all that had been built into her. Late one clear night, moving through a region known to hold ice, she encountered an iceberg in her path. What followed has been told many times, and we will hold it lightly here. The collision was not the great head-on crash one might imagine. The iceberg was sighted only when it was close, and in the moments that remained, the crew tried to steer around it and slow the ship. Instead of striking it squarely, the vessel grazed the ice along her side, a glancing contact that lasted only seconds. To many aboard, the impact felt slight, a shudder or a faint grinding, easily mistaken for something minor. Yet beneath the waterline, that brief contact had done quiet and serious harm. Along a length of the hull, plates were buckled and seams were sprung open, allowing the sea to enter. The damage was spread across several of the forward compartments, more than the design had been meant to withstand. Here, the careful logic of the watertight compartments met a situation it had not been built for. The compartments could contain flooding in a few sections, but water was now entering too many of them at once. The very strength that had divided the hull so sensibly could not hold back so broad a wound. As the forward sections filled, the ship began to settle slowly by the bow, and then a subtle feature of the design revealed its limit. The bulkheads, those great dividing walls, did not rise the full height of the ship. As the bow sank lower, water reaching the top of one flooded compartment could spill over into the next, like liquid brimming over the walls of an ice tray, one section feeding into another. Thomas Andrews, the man who knew the ship most intimately, is said to have understood quickly what this meant. The vessel that had seemed so secure was, in this particular and unforeseen circumstance, beyond saving. The mathematics of flooding had turned against her. We will not dwell on the hours that followed, nor on the human story of that night, which deserves its own quiet telling another time. For tonight, our gaze rests on the engineering and on the sober truth it reveals. Every design has conditions under which it holds and conditions under which it does not. The Titanic had been built well by the standards and knowledge of her time. She met her end not because her builders were careless, but because reality presented a situation outside the assumptions on which she had been designed. The limit was real, and it was crossed. There is no triumph in this part of the story, and no simple blame. There is only the meeting of human work with a world larger and less predictable than any plan can fully capture. From that hard lesson, however, something lasting would eventually grow. In the years that followed, the loss of the Titanic changed the way the world thought about safety at sea. New agreements were reached among seafaring nations, requiring that ships carry enough lifeboats for every soul aboard. The old assumptions had been broken, and from that breaking came reform. Other changes followed as well. Ships were required to keep their wireless rooms staffed at all hours, so that a call for help would never again go unheard. In the night, a patrol was established to watch the North Atlantic for drifting ice, warning vessels of danger along their paths. In these ways, a single loss reshaped the practices of an entire industry, and the sea was made a little less perilous for all who came after. It is worth remembering, too, that the Titanic was one of three sisters. Her elder sister, the Olympic, sailed on for many years, crossing the ocean again and again, a long and largely uneventful working life. The same basic design that is remembered for one tragic night also carried countless travelers safely across the water for decades. This is part of what makes the story so worth holding gently. The engineering was neither a simple triumph nor a simple failure. It was human work, capable and flawed, sound in most respects, and undone by a single circumstance its makers had not foreseen. Such is the nature of building at the very edge of what an age can do, where ambition reaches just beyond the knowledge meant to support it. There is a quiet dignity in the labor we have followed tonight. Thousands of hands in a Belfast yard shaped raw steel into something vast and beautiful, working in heat and noise and danger, raising a structure that astonished the world. Their craft was real and their skill was genuine, whatever the ending that history would record. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to remember the Titanic, not only as a warning, though she is that, but as a testament to human ambition and skill, and to the humility that the sea, in time, returns to us. We build, we learn, and we build again, a little wiser each time. So let the great gantry stand once more in the mind, empty against the evening sky. Let the hull rise within it, rib by rib and plate by plate. Let the engines be lowered in, the funnels raised, the lights kindled along her decks, and the ship slip quietly into the water she was made for. And then let the image soften and fade, as all things do. The yard grows quiet. The hammers fall still one by one. The loft lies dark and smooth beneath the stars, and the work of a long-ago day rests in memory. You do not need to carry any of it with you into sleep. You need only let the night settle over the harbor and over you, like a calm sea closing gently over the deep. The world slows, and so do we. Good night.